Sure, it'll only cost you your soul, you used to jokingly say whenever you did something for free. Everyone always got a laugh out of it, and so did you. Until the first soul showed up in your living room with a very, very tired-looking reaper. Story 1. Death looked tired. Oddly enough, this was the first thought Ed had, staring at the robed figure in his doorway. Darkened circles lined empty sockets, resembling smudges of ash on Death's high, bleached cheekbones. "Can I help you?" Ed inquired. Standing at a modest 5'8", jeans and a t-shirt, coffee in hand, Ed didn't feel the least bit dead. Death let out a very long, shoulder-slumping sigh. "Unfortunately, yes. You can stop bartering souls, for a start," said Death. His sentence ended with a wheeze. Ed, looking perplexed, uttered a simple, "Pardon?" "Listen and listen well. As you can imagine, I am incredibly busy. I've spent the last week schlepping about with this." Death paused to lift up something that resembled a glowing worm, about 3 inches long. He continued, "This unfortunate soul was supposed to be bound for hell. I have a rather large bucket of these. I was unable to enter the gates until I had weeded out that which does not belong. Thousands of worms, and I had to single out this poor, plumber, was it?" Ed sipped his coffee as he listened raptly. Plumber? Hadn't Joe, his plumber neighbor, passed away about a week back? They weren't exactly close, but Joe would frequently borrow his hedge trimmers. At this recollection, Ed choked as his coffee went down the wrong pipe. Hadn't he always joked and said, "You can borrow it, but it'll only cost your soul," with an exaggerated wink? Death, not accustomed to human interaction, ignored Ed's sputtering and resumed, "It's not exactly unheard of, selling off your soul to another mortal, but there's usually some packs written out, worked through the proper channels. It would seem you have slipped through the cracks." The Reaper paused frequently and had a very slow, methodical way of speaking. Edward, himself unaccustomed to dealing with mythical beings, felt humor might be a good coping mechanism. "Well, that's not all bad, right? If you were coming for me, I guess my name would be Deadward," he said, with a chuckle. Death paused, raised a finger, paused again and inhaled, "That's actually pretty funny. I enjoy dark humor. It might lighten my mood when next we meet." "Won't be for a long time, yet?" Ed asked, nervously. "Oh, sooner than you'd think, I suppose. I'll be dropping numerous souls off for you in the future, quite regularly. You're in the books, now." "Pardon?" The perplexed look had returned to Ed's face. "You've made numerous contracts. Quite successful at it, really. I hadn't seen anyone collect quite so many since they were burning people alive for this kind of thing. Quite impressive, really. Would be nice if there were some award for it, but I guess the souls are enough. Anyway, I'm off. Enjoy." Death placed the small, glowing worm in Ed's hand and gently closed the recipient's fingers for them. With a rustle of a cloak, Death wrapped in on himself, slowly disappearing into nothing. "Hey Ed!" screeched the little worm. Eyes bulging, Ed jerked his head down to stare at the worm. "At Joe? I reckon that hedge trimmer should have been lined with gold and did all the trimming on autopilot, considering the cost, Ed?" Joe quipped. Throat constricting, Ed croaked out, "What am I going to do with you? Could go for a bit of a nibble, if you don't mind. Maybe a little nip of whiskey. I'm all out of sorts." The voice of the worm was high-pitched, warbly and generally disconcerting. Ed leaned his head back, staring at the ceiling. With a brief shrug of his shoulders, Ed says, "Yeah, all right." In you go, and carries Joe inside. "Take a picture, why don't ya? It'll last longer." Ed had been staring at the soul of Joe for a very long time. The worm-like essence of dead neighbor reared up on itself, angled towards Ed and asked, "Mind turning the game on, at least?" "Cowboys are on." Ed snorted in disgust, "Dallas Cowboys? Really? They're like the worst team, man. Best cheerleaders," Joe says, matter-of-factly. "Am I winking?" "I'm trying to wink." Ed was being reintroduced to the numerous reasons why he was not close with Joe. Ed responded tonelessly, "No, you're nearly formless. No eyelids, no eyes, no eyebrows." Joe wiggled in agitation, "That sucks. How am I going to see anything?" The fledgling soul started grunting and stretching itself out. Ed, in a panic, starts waving his arms around wildly. Whoa, dude, you can't just drop a deuce here. Do you need to go outside? Ignoring Ed, Joe continued to exert himself, followed by a loud pop. The tip of the worm now sported a bulbous eye, that immediately gave a heavy wink in Ed's direction. Oh, I don't think I like that, whispered Ed. Joe jumped up and down triumphantly, shouting, yeah! Look at this! I did it! Damn, that's exhausting! Weighing his options internally, Ed reached out and lifted his new charge. Well, I guess we should be finding out where you belong. Maybe get your situation sorted out. Ed said. Oh, I'm yours. I belong to you, says Joe, nonchalantly. Ed's mouth hung agape. Oh yeah, it's totally cool with me, though. Dude, I was on my way to hell. Then, like some kind of miracle, right at the gates they pick me out of thousands of little grubby assholes and say you are going back. I'm getting carried around by death himself, who's getting pretty damn tired of trying to track down who I belong to. They're going through this gigantic book, line by line, and come up with Butte Kiss. Death is getting pretty mad, but he ain't nearly as mad as Satan. Dude was wicked pissed. Ed had been nodding along absent-mindedly, his head abruptly stopping mid-nod. Wait, what? Satan? The Satan? Joe hadn't quite noticed Ed's ashen pallor, and continued, yeah, he was following death around the entire time, clicking on those hoofs of his in a huff. Talking about how he's going to find this soul-stealing idiot, yada yada yada, turn him inside out, blah blah blah. Yada, yada yada. Joe winced as he tried pressing his new eye onto the TV remote power button. Ow, that smarts. Oh. That is, beyond terrifying. Where was he last? How do I get away from Satan? Church? I don't think I'm priest material. Can you escape Satan? Ed asked. Probably not. He's been hanging out on that bench across the street ever since we got here. What? Ed streaked toward the window, but immediately fell backward when a figure with molten skin and a trench coat tapped on the glass. I would like to have a word with you, sneered the devil, muffled by the glass. Ed wheeled around, holding his hands out imploringly toward Joe, who was still attempting to turn the TV on. What do I do? What do I do? Ed yelled. Just be calm, remember your rights and tell him he needs a warrant, responds Joe. Hopping up and down while straining every muscle, Ed screams, he's not the goddamn police, man. There was a knock on the door. Ed backing toward the door in a crouch, pointing accusingly at Joe, hissing, this is your fault. Your fault. Ed swings the door open, inhales deeply and sticks out his hand stiffly. Well, hey there, Satan. Ah, what brings you around? Satan tilted his head slightly, leaned back, and in an exacerbated tone says, come on, man, can we not do this? Not do this whole, act like you don't know what's going on deal? Get right to the point. Satan didn't quite pose the intimidating figure Ed had been expecting. A well-worn bathrobe and fuzzy slippers peeked out from under his coat. Leaning back to stare over his sunglasses, he asked, well, what do you want? An all-too-familiar perplexed look found its way back to Ed. Pardon? Ed asked, quizzically. Oh no you don't, Satan. Ha. I belong to him, now. I got myself a soul daddy. Cries out Joe. With a look of distaste, the devil calls back, hey, don't call it that, man. That's kinda weird. Ed agreed. Anyway, what do you want? It's your soul legally, but people aren't supposed to, escape hell, man. It's the entire point. Yeah, dig? So, I'm buying. You can have I dunno, you could have the power of flight, you could. Satan was interrupted by Ed saying, yeah, that. Satan is taken aback. What? Yeah, I want to fly. I'll buy that. Ed says. Dude, what the fuck? Screams Joe, the white of his eye peeling back. With a snap of his fingers, Joe begins floating slowly toward the devil's outstretched hand. In a mournful voice, Joe calls out, Duilwood. Come on, what the hell? What the hell? You asshole, you son of a bitch, you. Plucking him out of the air like a fruit, Satan stuffs Joe into his robe pocket. Ed, flexing his arms, asks, so how do I turn it on? "Oh, you're flying already. You just have to think about it," says Satan. The newfound soul dealer looked around in confusion. "Yeah, you can fly like, about a centimeter over the ground. You're technically flying. Later," Satan says with a wink. He then proceeds to nudge the ground slightly with his toes, like he were digging them into the sand. The earth tears like a wave from the tip of his foot, as he lifts it up to his hand to pull the rest of the way. With a small duck, Satan tips himself into the molten innards of the earth, sealing it shut behind him. "Still pretty cool, though," mutters Ed, as he floats toward the kitchen. Story 2. Another soul had slipped through Daniel's letterbox during the early apricot morning, before he'd woken. This particular soul was a puddle of purple oil that had splashed onto his hallway's faux wood laminate. Daniel took out a brand new sponge from the cupboard beneath the sink, then held it softly above the soul. The purple patch oozed upwards in tears and bubbles until it clung completely, safely, to Sponge's surface. "There we are," said Daniel, as he placed the sponge on the kitchen table. "One moment, I'll just fetch you a jar." The sponge shook ever so slightly. "Don't be scared, things will improve, I promise. It might just take a while." Daniel's house was packed with empty jars, like a sweet shop after a closing down sale. He picked an empty jar with a blue label clinging to it from off the windowsill, then with a pen, crossed out the name on the label. Gingerly, Daniel's liver-spotted hands twisted the sponge over the jar until the soul let itself drip into it. As soon as the lid clattered closed, the jar began to glow lantern bright. "Now," he said, slipping on a pair of spectacles, then holding the jar in front of his yellowing eyes, "let's get a better look at you. See if I can't work out where you belong, eh?" He'd had 100 souls or more come through his letterbox over the years. But it'd been at least 2 years since the last. Daniel had never caught the delivery person, only a glimpse once, through his apartment's spy hole, a whisk of torn grey cloak spindling around the corner and onto the stairwell, the yellow ceiling light glinting low down, hinting at a bone-white foot. The jar was steaming up already. Symbols were being scrawled into the purple moisture from the inside, as if the glass held a living finger rather than a soul. For many years, Daniel had kept the souls he'd been given. His wife had encouraged him to release them, but they seemed happy enough on the shelves, painting their glass homes with the decorations of their lives, of books they'd written, of lovers they'd kissed, of rainbows they'd witnessed. They scrawled their lives onto the moisture of the jar like notes left from one lover to another on a steamed-up mirror. Some of these souls, through the various clues, he recognized. A primary teacher, an elderly neighbor. He remembered the promises these souls had made to him in life in return for a helping hand. Disingenuous promises, a harmless joke, really, but apparently binding. Once, not long before his wife had passed, one jar on an old bookshelf became wildly animated. It shook and trembled, and despite Daniel trying to calm its occupant, "It's okay, no harm will come to you as long as I'm here," the jar toppled from its ledge and cracked open on the floor. The soul spilled out on the laminate to never move again. That was when Daniel finally made up his mind, when he listened to his wife. Together, they determined to solve every clue on every jar until they could scrawl a name on each label and know exactly who each jar contained. Then, they would return the souls to their families. Let their loved ones say a final farewell before releasing them. Daniel sat at his table and watched this latest soul draw its own clues: flowers, hearts, a globe, a romantic spirit, he thought. A spirit surely happy with the life it led. He'd find its family and return it, when he could. He held a pen in his hand, waiting for the clue that would jog his memory and reveal the occupant. It wasn't until this spirit began drawing rows of tiny jars, their lids slid off, and what looked like butterflies within leaping towards the clouds, that he knew. "Eloise," he whispered. His pen clattered onto the table. More hearts etched themselves into the purple moisture. His wife had died a year ago. Surely it couldn't be. But how many times had he done something for her, only to make that stupid joke? He didn't own her soul. Didn't want to. Love didn't work like that. "I miss you," he said. A smiling face. "So damn much," he said, as he opened the lid. The soul had warmed itself into a state like gas. It exhaled the sound of a deep breath as it left the jar. A tiny purple cloud, a butterfly if you squinted, feathered around his neck and ears and cheeks. Gentle as a kiss against his skin. Then the cloud began to expand, the particles separating. He smiled through his tears as the purple evaporated into the air around him. He'd see her again, soon, if he was lucky. Hey, thanks for watching. If you want to see more, YouTube thinks you might like these videos.